The rain had not stopped since dawn, and by the time I reached the quiet office on Main Street, grief had already soaked through me like the weather outside. I thought I was only there to hear the formalities of my brother's passing, to sit across from an old lawyer and sign documents that would close one chapter of sorrow. But life has a way of striking hardest when the ground is already unsteady. What I heard that day did not feel like the end of something. It was the beginning of a storm I could not yet see. Grant had always been the kind of man who seemed carved from stone, silver hair, neat, his words measured like clock hands. He guided me into his office and, with the steady calm of his profession, announced that Aldrich, my brother, had left me his estate in its entirety, a mansion on the outskirts of Portland, $3 million in liquid assets, majority shares in his company. The numbers sounded like thunder in my ears, echoing louder than the rain against the windows. Wealth was never my pursuit, and Aldrich knew that. But what I felt most was not the weight of money, it was his trust. My brother's final act of protection, placed in my hands, yet before I could breathe in that truth, the door opened. My heart stumbled at the sight, for 30 years had passed, and still I knew him at once. Rowan, my son, his jaw once sharp, now softened by time, hair streaked with gray, but those eyes restless, watchful, were unchanged. He said "Mom," as if the word had been locked away in his throat for decades. He reached for me with a hug I allowed, though my body stiffened under the sudden flood of memory. 30 years of silence and absence, shattered by the single word he spoke with deliberate weight. The air shifted, and I saw where his gaze landed not on me, but on the papers spread across the desk. His lips curved faintly, hunger flickering at the edges of his smile. In that instant, grief gave way to something sharper. I understood that Aldrich's warning, spoken in hushed candor months before his death, had not been born of paranoia. If wealth comes to you, he had said, those who left may return, not for you, for what you hold. I had brushed his words aside then, unwilling to believe such foresight could be true. But as Rowan leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing on figures he had not earned, the echo of my brother's voice became prophecy. My mind drifted backward, carried unwillingly through decades of silence. Rowan had not always been a stranger. Once he was a boy who laughed too loudly, who hated the discipline Aldrich believed was the cornerstone of survival. The fights began small, missed chores, skipped classes, but by 18, the tension snapped. I still remember his voice cutting like glass through our kitchen, accusing me of siding with my brother, of choosing rules over his happiness. He stormed out that night, slamming the door so hard the frame rattled, and this time, he never came back. I waited, foolishly at first, setting his favorite meals on the stove, leaving the porch light burning as though it might guide him home. Birthdays came and went with untouched cakes. At Christmas, I hung his stocking anyway. Letters sat unsent in a drawer, gifts gathered dust. Aldrich told me not to blame myself, that Rowan had to face the consequences of his choices. But what does a mother do with silence that stretches into years, then decades? Even as my hair silvered, I waited for a phone call that never came. Now, he was here. Not with apology, but with entitlement. $3 million, he muttered under his breath before looking at me. Mom, you can't expect to manage all this alone. I'm your only son. I deserve a share. The word deserve cracked something inside me. He did not come back because grief pulled him. He came because wealth called his name. Mr. Grant remained firm, explaining that Aldrich's will left everything solely to me. Rowan's jaw tightened, his voice sharpening as he pressed. "And what about blood? Doesn't that mean something?" His knuckles whitened against the armrest, his gaze searing through me like accusation. I forced myself to meet his eyes. The boy I once loved so fiercely was gone, replaced by a man who had returned not with love, but with demands. I thought of the nights I used to set 2 places at the dinner table, convincing myself superstition might trick fate into filling the empty chair. I thought of the years of waiting, the silence that hollowed me. And now, when he finally returned, the word mom felt less like love and more like currency. Each syllable weighed down with expectation, meant to soften me into surrender. But I was not the same woman who once begged him to stay. I had survived 30 years of absence, and Aldrich had entrusted me with more than wealth. He had given me the strength of his faith. Across the desk, Mr. Grant opened a thick folder of documents, Aldrich's careful preparations laid out in ink and notarized signatures. The estate was bound fully to me, with protections against any challenge Rowan might bring. Even in death, my brother's hand shielded me from the storm now brewing across the table. Rowan's mask slipped then, charm draining into rage as he muttered, so he thought he could cut me out entirely. His fists clenched, his eyes narrowing with a promise that this fight was only beginning. That evening, when the rain followed me back to the mansion, I thought I might find silence as a companion. Instead, the gravel outside crunched beneath familiar tires, and soon the knock rattled the front door. Rowan stood there, rain clinging to his coat, voice softened with practiced regret. I was young. I made mistakes. "Can't we start over?" he asked, but his eyes roamed the house with calculation, lingering on portraits and polished woodwork as he murmured, "This could be ours." I stepped aside, though unease coiled tightly inside me. Rowan entered the foyer with a cautious grace, his gaze sliding across chandeliers, carved banisters, and portraits as if he were appraising them for a future auction, rather than seeing them as remnants of Aldrich's life. When his eyes returned to mine, his smile carried a softness too deliberate, too practiced. "I'm your son," he reminded me, voice low but weighted. "Your only son. Blood counts for something." His tone left no doubt that this was not a plea. It was a claim. I steadied myself. The walls of the mansion seemed to echo with Aldrich's voice, his warning that family does not always come for love. I thought of the letter he had once written in his precise hand, tucked away until after his death, and felt that his foresight had been sharper than I ever wished to believe. Rowan was not here because 30 years of regret had finally broken him. He was here because fortune had landed in my lap. "Family is proven by actions, not by DNA," I told him quietly. His eyes flared, the softness of his expression burning away in an instant. "You think a lawyer and some papers will stop me?" he snapped. "I'll challenge this in court. You can't erase me." His words sliced the silence, but I forced calm into my voice. "You erased yourself the day you walked away. Aldrich only ensured you couldn't return for the wrong reasons." For a moment, his mask slipped completely. Fury twisted his features, his jaw tight, his fists clenched white. But then, as though he realized rage would not serve him, He sat back with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "You'll regret this," he muttered. It was not the voice of reconciliation. It was the voice of a man sharpening his next move. The following morning, Mr. Grant arrived with a slim envelope sealed in wax. He placed it on the dining table with careful hands. "Your brother asked that this be given to you when the time came," he said. My fingers trembled as I broke the seal and unfolded the letter. Aldrich's familiar script, steady and deliberate. "My dear sister," it began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and Rowan has returned. Know first that I never stopped loving my nephew, but love does not blind me to truth. He has gifts, yes, but flaws he refuses to temper. Responsibility without discipline is a torch in dry grass. I could not entrust him with the weight of what I built, not because I wished him harm, but because I feared he would squander it. I chose you, Celeste, because you carried hardship with dignity. What I leave behind is not a prize, but a burden, and you are the one I trust to bear it." As I read aloud, Rowan's face tightened, pride and pain wrestling beneath the surface. Then rage won. So he thought I wasn't good enough. Rowan spat, his voice rising, his fists curled, his breath ragged, but I folded the letter with calm precision and said, "He thought you weren't ready to value what mattered most." Rowan's chair scraped harshly against the floor as he stood. His voice cracked with fury. "He poisoned you against me for 30 years. And you let him? You're my mother, you owe me more than this. If you don't give me what's mine, I'll drag you through court, smear Aldrich's name, make your life hell." Mr. Grant, composed as ever, pressed a small button near the door. "That will not be necessary," he said evenly. Within seconds, 2 men stepped inside, their presence quiet but commanding. Rowan collapsed back into his chair, sobs breaking free as though fury had cracked open a well of desperation. "I had nothing all these years," he choked, "and now you sit here with everything." His eyes burned at me, filled with betrayal. I stood firm, though my heart ached. "Rowan," I said softly, "you chose to walk away. Aldrich did not make you leave, and no letter, no courtroom, no inheritance can undo the choices you made." His face twisted, torn between shame and rage, but he allowed the men to guide him out. His final words lingered like smoke. "You'll regret this." The house was silent again after the echo of his footsteps faded. For a long moment, I stood unmoving, then whispered goodbye, not to the man Rowan had become, but to the illusion that he might ever truly return as the son I once knew. It was a farewell that had waited 30 years to be spoken. In the weeks that followed, grief gave way to a quiet resolve. I began walking through the mansion with different eyes. I repainted the walls, moved furniture, and filled corners with photographs and books that spoke to my own life rather than to shadows of the past. What had once been Aldrich's house of discipline slowly became my home of resilience. The silence that had once pressed heavy against me softened into something else. It no longer carried abandonment alone. It carried freedom. One afternoon, as the light slanted golden through the tall windows of the study, Mr. Grant returned with more documents to finalize. Among them was a proposal we had spoken about briefly before a scholarship fund in Aldrich's name. The thought of channeling his fortune into opportunities for young people steadied me in a way wealth itself never could. Aldrich had always preached that stability was survival, and now his legacy would build that stability for others who, like me once, had lived without certainty of tomorrow. As I signed the papers, I felt a measure of peace. The money would not gather dust. It would not be squandered in hands unready. It would live on in futures shaped by effort, discipline, and dignity. But even as I shaped this future, shadows from the past clung to the edges of my days. Rowan was not finished with his threats. Letters began arriving, formal notices, legal warnings, attempts to challenge Aldrich's will. Mr. Grant handled each with calm efficiency, producing documentation Aldrich had prepared, leaving no space for Rowan to wedge a claim. Still, the weight of anticipation pressed against me. Every knock at the door startled me. Every ring of the phone made my chest tighten. I had learned long ago how silence can hollow a person, but I was learning now how expectation of conflict can do the same. When Rowan did appear again, it was not with lawyers, but with a quiet persistence. He came alone, his voice lowered, almost tender. He spoke of years of struggle, of mistakes he wished he could undo. I had nothing. "Mom," he murmured one evening, standing in the dim light of the porch. "No one, no family. I thought of you every year, every birthday. I just couldn't come back. Not then." His eyes glistened, and for a heartbeat, the ache of motherhood rose sharp within me. I wanted to believe him. To believe 30 years of silence had not been absence, but exile. Self-inflicted and regretted. Yet, even as he spoke, his gaze slid toward the windows of the mansion, lingering on the warm glow inside. The comfort, the proof of inheritance. The words may have been apology, but his eyes betrayed calculation. That truth cut sharper than his threats ever had. I realized then that Rowan's love, if it still lived at all, was bound to conditions. His presence was tethered to wealth, to ownership, to what he believed was his by birthright. "Blood may link us," I told him, my voice steady, "but it doesn't entitle you to what Aldrich built, or to the trust he left me. Family is proven by presence, not by demands." His jaw tightened, the softness dissolving into the familiar hardness of accusation. "You'll see me in court," he muttered before vanishing into the night. Weeks stretched on. Court papers arrived, were contested, and dismissed. Rowan's persistence became its own kind of haunting. Yet with every challenge overturned, I felt Aldrich's shield more strongly. My brother had not only left me wealth, he had left me protection, foresight, a structure that no bitterness could dismantle. And still, beneath the legal battles, beneath the fury and entitlement, I sometimes saw flickers of the boy Rowan had been. The boy who once laughed too loud at his own jokes, who ate his meals quickly but left crumbs on the table, who dreamed of freedom larger than rules could contain. That boy seemed trapped now, buried beneath decades of resentment and hunger for what was not his. Late at night, I would sit by the fire and let my mind wander. Was there ever a moment I could have changed his path? Was there a word unsaid? A hand not held? A punishment too sharp? A silence too long? Motherhood is heavy with questions that never find answers. But one truth became clear to me in those nights of reflection. I could not sacrifice my present peace for the illusion of repairing what Rowan had chosen to abandon. Aldrich had entrusted me with more than an estate. He had entrusted me with a chance to live without fear, to define family by presence, loyalty, and care not by demands spoken through clenched teeth. And so, I began to choose differently. I wrote my own will, carefully, deliberately. I named those who had proven kindness when there was nothing to gain the neighbor who brought soup when Aldrich was ill. The housekeeper, who had stayed faithfully for decades. A distant cousin who wrote letters even in years of silence. My inheritance would pass to loyalty, not bloodlines, to love, not entitlement. I felt lighter when the papers were done, as though I had finally closed a door Rowan could no longer push open. One evening, after signing the last of those papers, I stepped into the hallway and paused at the front door. In my hand was a new set of keys. The locks had been changed. I lingered before turning the key, hearing the soft click as it sealed. It was not just the sound of security, it was the sound of release. The house behind me felt safe, not only from intrusion, but from ghosts of expectation. Blood had given me grief. Love, the steadfast kind Aldrich had shown, had given me peace. The days settled into a rhythm, gentler than before. I walked through the mansion not as a guest in my brother's shadow, but as its keeper, shaping it slowly into a home that reflected who I had become. I filled shelves with books I had long meant to read, arranged photographs of moments that spoke to resilience rather than loss, and opened curtains to let in sunlight that had been shut out for years. Each change was a quiet declaration this house, once Aldrich's monument to discipline, now carried my voice, my story, my freedom. Yet freedom, I learned, is not without its echoes. Some evenings, when the rain tapped softly against the windows, I found myself standing at the grand staircase, remembering Rowan as a boy bounding down steps 2 at a time, laughter spilling ahead of him. Memory is cruel that way it paints the past with colors so vivid you almost believe you could step back into them. But the present had hardened him into a man whose laughter had turned to bitterness, whose return was tethered not to love, but to inheritance. That knowledge, though painful, was steadying. It reminded me that love cannot be forced to bloom where it has withered. The legal skirmishes continued for months, each dismissed with the precision of Aldrich's planning. Rowan's threats shifted from grand declarations to smaller, desperate gestures letters left unanswered. Calls I let ring into silence. His persistence was a shadow I could not ignore, yet it grew thinner with each failed attempt. One morning, Mr. Grant arrived with the final ruling. Rowan's challenges were exhausted. The estate was sealed beyond contest. Your brother's foresight was extraordinary, Mr. Grant said, his tone softer than usual. He protected you in ways most would never think to. I nodded, feeling tears press at the edges of my eyes. It was as though Aldrich's voice reached through time, guiding me still. With the legal battles behind me, I turned more fully to the work Aldrich would have respected. The scholarship fund launched quietly but with firm purpose. Students from backgrounds like mine, children who had grown up without stability, now had a door opened where once there had been none. Each letter of thanks that arrived filled me with something money itself could never grant, the sense that grief had been transformed into a legacy that breathed life into others. Aldrich's fortune was no longer numbers in an account. It was hope, handed from one generation to the next. At night, when the fire crackled in the hearth, I allowed myself the quiet luxury of reflection. For years, I had carried silence as a burden, the silence of Rowan's absence, the silence of unanswered birthdays and empty chairs. Now silence had changed its weight. It was no longer absence, but presence. It wrapped around me not as grief, but as peace. Still, there were moments when Rowan's shadow flickered at the edges of my thoughts. I wondered where he was, what he was doing, whether rage still fueled him or if exhaustion had finally broken it down. I wondered if he ever thought of the boy he once was, the boy who laughed too loud and dreamed too big. Motherhood does not surrender easily. Even when reason demands it, the heart lingers. Yet I knew that love without accountability becomes a chain, dragging both down into the same pit. I had chosen to break that chain. One evening, I found myself walking the long gravel drive, the mansion rising behind me in twilight. The air was cool, the sky streaked with fading light. I paused and looked back at the house, its windows glowing softly. For the first time in decades, I felt not like a woman waiting for a phone call, for a return, for a reconciliation that would never come, but like a woman living. Aldrich had given me more than wealth. He had given me the chance to redefine family, to draw its borders not by blood, but by presence, loyalty, and care. I thought then of the lesson I wanted to carry forward, the one I hoped the world might hear through my story. Blood can bind us, yes, but it is not blood that sustains us. What endures are the choices we make for each other, the meals brought in illness, the letters written in silence, the hands that reach out when nothing is to be gained. Love is not a claim, it is a presence. So I chose, every day, to honor that truth, to pour my energy into those who stood beside me, into students whose futures would be brighter because Aldrich's legacy lived through them. The mansion, once heavy with shadows of grief and expectation, had become a place of light, of peace, of freedom. And as I closed its doors each night, I whispered a quiet promise to myself: never again would silence be a burden. From now on, it would be a sanctuary. If this story touched you, I invite you to like, share, and subscribe so that more stories of resilience and reflection can find their way to those who need them. And tell me in the comments, what does family mean to you?